Well, welcome. My name is Matt Dinan. I'm the director of the Great Books program here. Um, as I mentioned before, Great Books is an interdisciplinary team-taught, seminar-based program at St. Thomas where we read both canonical and books from contemporary and diverse authors from every kind of area of human endeavor you can imagine. So the way that this typically works is that it's really straightforward. The students read books, I read the book, and then we get together and we talk about it. And that is that's really all it is. It's kind of the quintessential kind of humanities undergraduate experience. And yet our program is unique in Canada. We are the only 4-year Great Books program in Canada that offers seminar-based courses for the entirety of your time at STU. So yeah, so we emphasize again kind of student engagement with primary texts, seminar-based classes, and intellectual community is something that we take very seriously. All our courses are team taught. You have more than one professor in the class with you. And the students get to know each other pretty well, so much so that I was able to convince a fair number of students to kind of come out on Saturday afternoon and do an extra class on something that they haven't technically been assigned for their regular classes. So a big shout out to our outstanding students who have joined us and very generously given our shared their time with us today. So we're going to be discussing a novel that maybe is familiar to some of you. This is one of the, as great books go, this is one of the greatest ones. It's Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Pride and Prejudice is maybe one of Jane Austen's most famous novels. Austen was a British novelist. She lived from 1775 to 1817. And Pride and Prejudice is really where I think we start to see Austen enter her full powers as a novelist. At this time, the novel is itself a novel art form. It's new. That's what novel means. And Austen is, as much as she is kind of participating in the genre of the novel, she's also kind of helping shape its future. And so much so that sometimes it's difficult to see what makes Jane Austen interesting, what makes her unique. So we're going to be talking about the first 6 chapters of Pride and Prejudice today. And just a very, very brief note, this is kind of how the way that it works in class as well. I'll say a couple of things, and then I'm going to ask some questions that our students will take over the conversation. So Pride and Prejudice is a book about a small group of middle class to upper middle class to members of the lesser nobility in Restoration England. So during the Napoleonic Wars, while Europe is kind of roiling with the kind of revolutionary fervor and really exciting things are happening, Jane Austen instead writes about families in the country. Most of what they spend their time doing is having dinner and talking to each other and going to dances. And so this is this kind of class that's developing, and eventually it'll become known as the bourgeoisie or the middle class. But in Austen's time, they were kind of known as the lesser gentry. And so my kind of opening question for those of you who've read all of Pride and Prejudice or who have read these first 6 chapters is, this is a book in which almost nothing happens. So why is it so interesting? Mason, go ahead. And then Bree.
One thing I'll say with Jane Austen, she's one of my favorite authors. What's so interesting is that, as you say, there's very little that happens that would be of great interest if you were actually living it. But when you read it and you read alongside Jane Austen, you kind of have a different way of looking at ordinary life, because Jane Austen is such a clever psychologist and so witty and so observant. And so you begin to see all these sort of fascinating things about ordinary experience that you would in real life, because you're kind of swept up by circumstances and your own concerns. You don't necessarily have the opportunity to reflect on your experiences as much. And Jane Austen sort of provides that as an opportunity.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much, Mason. Bree, and then Claudia.
Yeah, I'm also a big Austen fan, so one of the things I find really refreshing about her work actually is while the maybe major plot points or scene changes could probably fit on a fair sized note card, the complexities of the relationships between Austen's characters are so rich and so developed that it's very hard to be bored reading a Jane Austen novel. You always find a character that you want to track throughout the novel. You always be invested in someone's theme or someone's love life. So it's a very easy novel to get sucked into. And I think the simplicity of the actual action makes that so much easier.
Yeah, really nice. So the complexities of the relationship and the way, that's similar to something Mason observed. The way that Austen presents these kind of regular parts of human life seem to give them an urgency that sucks us in, as you say. Claudia, go ahead.
I think what makes it really interesting about this book in particular with Pride and Prejudice is that it really focuses on like the nuances of the interactions. It's not something that's really focused on maybe appearance. It's everything that you're getting, the impressions that you're getting of these characters are based on what they're saying, what they stand for, and their way that they interact with not just the people in their family or their community, but society as a whole. So I think that's one of the really important distinctions about the book is that it forces the audience or the readers to really make their own first impressions based on what Jane Austen is really allowing you to see in that moment. Because at the end of the day, once you finish the book, that's when you can really make some type of judgment that has substance. But Jane Austen forces you in that moment to have some sort of opinion of these characters, and either she'll really like add on to it and support your own opinions, or she'll present you with contradicting information where you have to be the one in order to figure out the complexity of all those nuances.
Yeah, that's great. And that actually gets at another question that I sort of had, which is about, this is a kind of classic thing that we always do in great books, is I always ask about titles and first lines, almost always, because they're almost always important. So we're going to kind of do that here. And Claudia kind of alluded to the issue of first impressions. Austen changed the name of this book like quite late. We have evidence in its kind of composition history, and it was initially kind of entitled First Impressions, and the title that it becomes published under is different. It's Pride and Prejudice, and so I guess I kind of wanted to know, like, what is pride and what is prejudice? Are they bad things? Because on the surface, they kind of seem like they might be bad. If we called someone prejudiced or prideful, these things might be kind of viewed as being bad. And like, how are they related? Like, how are pride and prejudice kind of, do they exist in the same kind of continuum of human qualities? And do they tell us, or are they related to this question or problem of first impressions somehow? Ethan, and then Emily, then Bree.
Yeah, just really shortly. I think that in large part, both Pride and Prejudice seem to be informing factors upon first impressions. These are things that are a part of yourself that you might like literally impress upon your first meeting of somebody. And so that is kind of a playful way of thinking about the change of the titles. Maybe as we're thinking about first impressions in the novel, it's important to think of the ways in which Pride and Prejudice might inform someone's first impression.
Right. So if one is and I guess I'll throw it back to you again, Ethan. Like how does pride or prejudice inform the first impressions that we make of people or that we have of people?
Yeah, in a lot of ways, it seems as though pride would be thinking a lot of oneself, right? The ways in which you would consider yourself capable of doing maybe more than you actually are, or thinking higher of yourself than maybe you actually are in real life. And so in this way, when you're going to meet someone else or you yourself are making a first impression, you can come across as prideful, or when you're reading someone else, you think they're lesser than you in a lot of ways. Prejudice, on the other hand, seems to be more concerned maybe with outside factors, right? You're classifying people when you use prejudice in a way that pride doesn't work in the same way.
Yeah. Okay, that's really interesting. I'm gonna let Emily and Bree and Claudia and Mason in, and then I have some kind of follow-up questions. Go ahead, Emily.
Yeah, and especially in the first 6 chapters, the very start, we meet a lot of larger than life characters, and in that way, Austen sort of invites us to make these first impressions on these characters. And I think especially with like the characters, Mr. Darcy, I guess, he comes off as this very proud person and not a very likable person. And like Elizabeth, a lot of the readers sort of put up this judgment, say, okay, just from this first impression, this is how I'm deeming him. And then it's sort of throughout the book. And then in that way, we form this prejudice against a character. And throughout the rest of the novel, you kind of see how your first impressions may have been a little bit too quickly made. Or on the other hand, maybe you miss certain things and then throughout the novel, you develop a new sort of prejudice.
Yeah, that's nice. I mean, I guess one thing there are two things in your comment, Emily, that are really good. Like the first one is that, like, inevitably, seemingly, we will have an opinion about ourselves that will relate to someone else, right? Which we could maybe kind of think of as pride, and that could kind of like solidify into a kind of prejudice, maybe. But on the other hand, the book is really interested in like it both shows us characters and it kind of invites us to pass judgment on them, but also it shows them judging others too, right? And so one of the things we'll see, I think, in the first few chapters, when we turn to those in a minute here, is that we're kind of not just judging characters, but we're judging them based on the judgments they make about others, which is really like, you know, as Mason kind of said earlier, like a part of ordinary life that we do just constantly, that we don't maybe always reflect on. Like, how could I get better at this, at meeting people, at judging them when I meet them? Like, that seems like, you know, a pretty important thing to know how to do. And to have a book that's about that, like, how could that not be interesting? I think. Bria and then Claudia.
Yeah, I was just going to say real quick, this is also a book that's really, really concerned with the lives and the allowed existence of the feminine, especially in space that Austen is writing. So how he utilizes both the negative sides of pride and prejudice, as well as depicting them as tools that these women have to use. It's really one of the most useful tools in their arsenal when they have to sell themselves to potential suitors. It's just such an interesting balance to walk, because they've had to use these tools all their lives, and there are repercussions of that, but it's also a great help for their social standing.
Right. And then I really like your kind of focusing in on this question of gender, right? Because Austen not only is a woman writer, but also is really interested in depicting, you know, kind of impressive women and giving us a full sense of their subjectivity, right? That it's not just them being judged by others, which is so common kind of in the social world that they are existing in, but they judge back. They also look at others. Claudia and then Mason.
Yeah, just very briefly to add on to all those wonderful points. One of the ways that I also interpreted this relationship between Pride and Prejudice is that just as how we see how many, or we're introduced to many prideful characters, I also viewed it as this idea of pride in the way that we're very proud to our own prejudice and our own biases. Sometimes it's very difficult for us to be much more open-minded and be willing to change our perceptions, which I think is one of the struggles of many of the characters in the book, where they have this first impression on a person or another character, and then it's very difficult for them to convince themselves that maybe that's not the case, and they end up actually even twisting the words of what other characters, their own judgments, what they're saying to them. They end up misinterpreting them to fit their own narrative that they already have in their head. So I think it's a very interesting relationship that these ideas of Pride and Prejudice have in relation to how we want to kind of navigate the world in a way that's fitting to us, and how we have to learn how to be much more open to other alternatives.
Yeah, that's great. That Pride and Prejudice can they seem necessary, right? Like we're necessarily going to have an opinion of ourselves. We will necessarily kind of bring experience, views, opinions to our interactions with others. But how can we, if this is necessary, how can we learn to be more open and to see things as they really are too? Is a really like difficult task, I think. And we see, the characters in the book struggle with this, I think, significantly. Mason.
Yeah, I just wanted to say on a literary level, something that's very fun about reading Austen is the way in which all these misdirections she gives you throughout. So for instance, as a literary technique, she uses, I learned this last year with Dr. Moore, she uses something called free and direct discourse, where it'll sound like she's giving her opinion, Austen's opinion on an event, but actually she's aping the opinion of some character. And so you get misdirected. You think you've got the omniscient voice of the narrator, but you're actually just hearing an opinion of a character, which might be wrong. And so Jane Austen sort of goes out of her way, I think, to confuse her readers in a similar way to someone who's writing a murder mystery would confuse their readers as to if it's a whodunit. In Jane Austen, there's no murder or anything of that kind. But instead of murder, it's about romance. Who's in love with who? Can you figure it out? So yeah, I think it's meant to train your judgment in that way.
Just as a brief aside, isn't it interesting how many times they try to do like, what if Jane Austen, but also murder, right? Like, what if there was more sex, or what if there was like some, kind of like sexy stuff like murder or crime or whatever? Like the worst thing that happens is like the most serious incident is that two characters run off together. They got to go on an unplanned vacation towards the end of the book, and this is treated as if like it's the asteroid approaching the Earth in Armageddon, right? So there is like it is very interesting, as you say, Mason, that it has this almost this sense of again, like this book ultimately will resolve in a number of romantic matches, but the kind of tension that Austen is able to build with this free and direct discourse, and with the kind of misdirection and the use of the seemingly omniscient narrator is remarkable. And that's an excellent segue actually to maybe looking at the book, which has a very famous first line, which maybe people know. It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife, right? This is one of our famous kind of lines in the history of English literature. However little known the feelings or views of such a man may be on his first entering a neighborhood, this truth is so well fixed in the minds of the surrounding families that he is considered as the rightful property of some one or other of their daughters. Okay, so this is like kind of works as the kind of opening of Pride and Prejudice, and as I said, a famous opening line. It is a truth universally acknowledged. What's going on with this line? What is Austen doing here? Is this a truth kind of universally acknowledged? We'll get Adam. I haven't heard from Adam yet today.
Yeah, sure. So I think this is a really good example of the sort of techniques that Mason brought up that Austen is using here. This might not be the same sort of free and direct discourse, but you really get the sense that this is an idea that some of the characters we're about to meet hold. This might not be a truth universally acknowledged, but it's definitely true among the family that we're about to meet. There's just so much personality in it that it really kind of shines through there.
Yeah, the kind of like the absolute certainty, right? Everybody knows that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of. I mean, what else would he be in want of, right? Bree and Emily.
Yeah, just quickly to build on Adam's point, not only is it, like Mason said, unclear whose opinion this is, but within a few lines, you become very aware of whose opinion it is, and it's Mrs. Bennett's opinion. So it's such an interesting way to introduce the opinions of a character that on the surface might be a little hard to empathize with, but you immediately get her understanding of the world, which I think if you hold with yourself, makes her actions more understandable later on.
Yeah, very good. Emily.
Yeah, I think this line just shows how like fun it is to read Austen's work, because like it's the first line before you've met any characters, and it kind of, she's enticing you to think like that's her opinion. And then you quickly find out that it's not a universal truth, and that you see which characters believe it is a universal truth and which don't. But just like Mason was saying, like she's really good at making you think it's her opinion, when in reality she's voicing the opinions of the characters, but not making it clear that she's doing that. And it's sort of like you have to read between the lines almost while reading her novels.
Yeah, very good. That our first impression of this novel is that it is presenting an extremely dubious proposition as a universal truth, right? And so I think like what better way could there be to to kind of have your to kind of situate yourself as a reader, like what do I think of myself, and what are my prejudices that I'm bringing to this book? Yeah, Alexis.
Yeah, I think it does a really good job of like introducing that problem of marriage from like the very first line. And I think because it's so ironic, and like we as readers immediately know, like, oh, like not every rich man necessarily is looking for a wife. I think it's interesting that like we can see through that, but it also kind of highlights that it is extremely necessary for people looking to be a wife.
Right. Yeah. And so it foregrounds that kind of experience of like there's so much in it, right? Like we get this difficult economic situation, right? Women in Austen's day do not have independent economic prospects. And one of the things that that we are kind of kept from understanding early on is the economic situation of the Bennet family, right? So a number of you alluded to the fact that that this is a sentiment that is very much Mrs. Bennet's opinion of life, right? And as it turns out, a single man in possession of a good fortune has moved very close to the Longbourn estate. Mr. Bingley has arrived in the neighborhood, and so the big kind of the action of the novel is like there's a new rich guy, and he's single, and he's in town, and Mrs. Bennet has 5 daughters, and this is the best day of her life that this has happened. And I'll let Bree and Mason get in briefly, and then we're believe it or not almost out of time. Go ahead.
Yeah, just super quick. It's also just the perfect way to open a novel that's going to track several love stories, because there are several characters who understand love in a more cynical context. So for the novel to start with that kind of cynical understanding of marriage, and then progress through all these different love stories and different generations, different economic gaps, different reasoning, is just such a fantastic way to set up basically disproving your own thesis later.
Yeah, that's great. It kind of immediately links this question of social class and economic status to, and then this institution of marriage, right, to eventually to the question of love, right, which are not the same thing, not the same questions, and kind of like immediately conflated for us. But in a way that, again, like, so we might have our doubts about this universally acknowledged proposition, but there is something, I think, about the way that we treat we kind of bring together, conflate the kind of institutions around love with its expression that remains a kind of live difficulty for us. Mason, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I was just thinking it's a fitting opening line for the novel in another way, that this is an expression of a universal truth, but it's actually just something that somebody desires. I want my daughters to be married, therefore it is a universal truth that if a young man is coming, he must be in want of a wife, especially if he's a good fortune. So and this will come up again and again as a psychological motif, I think, in the novel, of the way in which people see things, how they desire to see things, how they want things to turn out, their prejudices, right? So yeah, I think it's a good opening in that way as well.
Yeah, that's great. So there's something about, there's a kind of clue as to how prejudices form right in that opening line, right? I want something, to be the case, or there's something that I want, and therefore it has to be the truth that this is the way that the world works. And so the first chapter, I think, kind of does this to us as readers. We meet Mrs. Bennet and Mr. Bennet kind of interestingly first. Of course, the main character, I think, in many ways is probably their daughter Elizabeth Bennet. Although really, like, the book wouldn't work in the same way if you didn't care about all the characters, right? I was just as I was rereading, there's this great line in the second chapter where one of the Bennet sisters, Mary, it says of her, Mary wished to say something very sensible, but knew not how. I mean, that's one sentence that just tells you everything you need to know about a character who is so self-serious and kind of ridiculous. But we meet Mr. and Mrs. Bennet. They're the first characters we meet. They are, of course, they have these 5 daughters. We don't know yet that they're in a very precarious economic situation because Mr. Bennet's estate has been entailed to Mr. Collins, another kind of male relative. Entail at this time was an institution where property could only pass from one male relative to another. Of course, deeply misogynistic, problematic, which Austen is getting us to see. But in this first chapter, we don't know any of this. We just see Mr. and Mrs. Bennet kind of talking about this Mr. Bingley, who has moved into the nearby manor house. And they're very excited about, or she in particular is very excited about this. And he is kind of snarky and sarcastic and mean to her about it. And so as we read that first chapter, we really get this sense of Mrs. Bennet as being kind of like risible. She is ridiculous. But then very interestingly, the final paragraph of chapter 1 brings that kind of knowing, omniscient narrator back. And I'm just going to read it, and then we can maybe just very briefly talk about what this shows us about Pride and Prejudice. It says, Mr. Bennet was so odd a mixture of quick parts, sarcastic humor, reserve, and caprice that the experience of 23 years had been insufficient to make his wife understand his character. Her mind was less difficult to develop. She was a woman of mean understanding, little information, and uncertain temper. When she was discontented, she fancied herself nervous. The business of her life was to see her daughters married. Its solace was visiting and news. It's very easy to, this is a kind of like slightly mean account of Mrs. Bennet, which doesn't say any of the mitigating kind of factors involved, that the economic future of herself and her family depends on them getting married. That's the first thing. Secondly, it's really easy to miss that Mr. Bennet doesn't look all that good either in this description. He's so odd a mixture of quick parts, sarcastic humor, reserve, and caprice, which means he just does whatever, right? That the experience of 23 years have been insufficient to make his wife understand his character, right? Like, he hasn't tried to get to know his wife in the 23 years that they've been married. He spends all of his time like just kind of trolling her and avoiding her, doing very little to help with the kind of education of his daughters. And so So I think one of the things we see early on is, we're given this kind of first impression through Mrs. Bennet's eyes. Then we're kind of encouraged to say, oh, well, Mr. Bennet's great and so smart and so interesting and so funny. And Mrs. Bennet, she's just kind of silly and we don't have to take her seriously. But within the first few chapters of the book, Austen is going to pull that rug right out from under us. And all of a sudden we found out that we've got all sorts of pride and all sorts of prejudices based on first impressions that we didn't think that we had, that we thought we were too smart to have. And so it not only, I think, is a kind of wonderful book for kind of what it says, but as we've kind of explored this morning or this afternoon, it gives us the opportunity to develop as judges and thinking about how Pride and Prejudice might influence our kind of being given over to first impressions of the people that we meet. All right, so that'll do it for us. That's our time. I really appreciate you all coming out on Saturday afternoon, and I look forward to seeing some of our participants in the open house on campus in the fall. Thank you very much.